Hello everyone and welcome. First things first, this kind of content is not what I usually do, so forgive me for not being as flashy as other veterans on the platform. But that aside, I think that the theory itself is what you're here for and not really anything else, right? So allow me to begin with the reason you clicked on this video and get that right out of the way. I believe that Zelda Breath of the Wild should be placed far into the future of the child timeline, and the child timeline alone. Whether you agree or not, maybe stick around and listen to my reasoning behind it. I won't claim to know every bit and piece of the franchise, but hopefully the evidence and case I present here will be enough to make you at least fancy the possibility that this placement may be indeed the one and only logical choice, and not just circumstantial. I will be addressing first a few minor details that often get commented about before telling you the main evidence that, at least in my opinion, strongly supports my claim. After this, I will also present a bit more evidence to support this theory, because I am aware that Four Swords Adventures is a thing, and I will not pretend the game does not exist or that it does not belong to this timeline. Let's start with a popular one, the rock salt that's found throughout the world whilst mining. Sure, it may remind us of the Great Sea of Wind Waker in the adult timeline, but we need to remember a couple of things. The first one being that an ancient sea was also present prior to the events of Skyward Sword, which took place at the beginning of it all chronologically speaking. And second, that Hyrule exists in a world that could at least be somewhat similar to our own Earth, but with magic, and as such, geographical shifts are bound to have happened thousands and even millions of years before Hylians even existed, thus making it all the more possible for these rocks to appear pretty much everywhere in the game. Next, let's talk about Koroks. They are either descendants of the Kokiri folk or the Kokiri themselves. They suggest a connection with the adult timeline as well. However, since Breath of the Wild clearly happens way into the future from everything else, the Kokiri turning into Koroks doesn't really say much in regards of what timeline the game takes place in. Fun detail I haven't heard others point out regarding the Koroks. May be unimportant, but they don't seem to hold any relationship with fairies anymore. At least not as they did back in Ocarina of Time. Maybe this disconnection between the two species was responsible for their current appearance. Maybe not. Only Nintendo knows. Maybe. Now, I would like to talk about the Rito tribe. Again, another argument in favor of the adult timeline. But is it really? I believe, and please bear with me on this one, that the Rito tribe from Wind Waker and the Rito tribe from Breath of the Wild are completely different species. And I have my reasons to believe this is so. First of all, the Rito from Wind Waker are hinted to be descendants of the Soras from Ocarina of Time. They were freshwater beings who could not survive in the salty Great Sea, and managed their way to the mountaintops where they received help from their new deity to turn into beings that would soar the skies. Something which I believe is very important to point out is that the Rito from Wind Waker are not really born with the ability to fly. They must instead receive said gift from the Dragon Valoo before even considering flight. While on the other hand, the Rito from Breath of the Wild are clearly born with this ability without the help of any sort of patron deity, and in fact, we even get to see pretty young children showcasing their ability to fly when we are required to gather the 5 Rito siblings in order to listen to the song that would allow us to unlock one of the many shrines in the game. This difference between the two tribes is quite big. I would argue that the only reason both tribes bear the same name could be as similar as to how, despite the enormous amount of actual, real species of birds there are in our own world, we can all agree that they are all birds despite their obvious differences. I would say that the Rito from Wind Waker are likely a species of seafaring bird people, not unlike albatrosses, while the Rito from Breath of the Wild are likely a species of land-faring bird people, further supported by how they live relatively far away from the coastline and actually very close to the mountains. So just as we can agree that both a Chihuahua and a Golden Retriever are both dogs, for example, we can also clearly see that they are not indistinguishable from each other. And I believe that to be the case with both Rito tribes in these two games. Let's continue this talk with Lynels, which until now only appeared in the Downfall timeline. Not much is known about them other than them being formidable adversaries. So, does this mean that Breath of the Wild should instead belong to this other timeline? I believe not. We don't know about their origin. It may be that they exist because of Ganondorf's influence over time, or simply natural evolution due to the lack of people in the Downfall timeline. But regardless which of these two possibilities may be, by the time of the second calamity in Breath of the Wild's lore, that is, the one where Link almost died and was rushed to the Shrine of the Resurrection, Lynels had the chance to come into existence due to the malice spreading and people either dying or being corrupted themselves into these new enemies. I don't really have anything else to say about the Downfall timeline at the moment. So let's move on to what I believe is the main evidence to support Breath of the Wild being the far future of the child timeline. This evidence is both Ganondorf and the Triforce of Power itself to some extent. Let's talk about Ganondorf in the other timelines first. We need to remember that Ganondorf has never appeared in the Downfall timeline, and in fact, it was only Ganon, and most of the later iterations of him within that timeline are mere resurrections of a monster which continuously loses resemblance to the cunning man he once was. I admit this sounds like Calamity Ganon alright, but keep in mind that now that we know that Ganondorf himself actually exists in Breath of the Wild's sequel, it is highly unlikely that Calamity Ganon was the real thing. Calamity Ganon was nothing but the manifestation of the real man's power thrown upon the world. Regarding the adult timeline, Ganondorf was left at the top of a tower with the Master Sword thrusted upon his head in a sunken kingdom, possibly lost forever, even if the kingdom were to re-emerge from within the depths. The chances of anyone removing the sword from him are unlikely, since we know that the sword can only be lifted by a few select people, and in this timeline, those people are happily riding trains in an undisclosed location far away from the original kingdom, so Breath of the Wild's Ganondorf cannot be this one at all. Now, before going on to the child timeline, let's just very briefly mention something that happened before the timeline split. When Link first encounters Ganondorf at his castle in Ocarina of Time, he turns to face Link and raises his fist at him. At this very moment, the Triforce of Power suddenly appears on the back of his hand. Before this moment happened, the Triforce of Power was not visible despite him having it for the past 7 years at that point, which leads me to believe that the Triforce of Power is not visible on his hand unless he is actively using its power. And this is an important detail. Moving on to Twilight Princess in the child timeline, while here Ganondorf did not previously possess the Triforce of Power, he is bestowed with its power nevertheless. Since we are speaking of the same Ganondorf and the same Triforce piece, I can only assume that the previously mentioned behavior remains true. The Triforce of Power will not be shown on his hand unless he's actively using its power, whether it be consciously or unconsciously. By the end of this game, we see what appears to be a very clear death of the King of Thieves. But was it really his death? Sure, we do see his eyes turn wide and the Triforce, quote-unquote, fading from his hand. But bear with me, please. Couldn't it be possible that Ganondorf was simply too exhausted after the fight that he simply stopped using the power of the Triforce piece at that moment and, I don't know, went to rest in a rather unusual position. After all, while a majestic death indeed, for anyone to remain standing after death always seemed a bit off to me. I propose that after his exhaustion, both Zelda and Link realized that the King of Thieves was indeed still alive, but merely unconscious, and fearing that it would not be possible to slay him because of the Triforce, plus how they had to deal with the disaster that resulted after attempting to banish him somewhere else, they instead resorted to sealing him in a more direct manner, somewhere not far away, but rather where they would be able to keep a close watch on him as to ensure that his freedom would not be regained again, like maybe under Hyrule Castle. Fast forward and the events of Breath of the Wild occur after 10,000 years from a first calamity. This to me means that Ganondorf, in his newly sealed state, probably requires that much time before being able to materialize his hatred or malice into the world. Since we know the events of the game happened after a first calamity, I would think it to be likely that Ganondorf has been sealed for maybe close to 20,000 years since the end of Twilight Princess, simply because the first calamity has been presented as a similar, if not equal event as the second one. That is, with a beast formed out of malice, and not the man himself. So the first calamity must have happened far into the future after Twilight Princess event, only after Ganondorf's malice became strong enough to materialize into the world in the form of Calamity Ganon, a mindless monster that just barely resembles the man himself, void of any reasoning and seeking only to destroy the world which keeps its source captive. And then 10,000 more years until Breath of the Wild. Now, let's talk about Four Swords Adventures and why it doesn't pose a problem to this theory. So far I have said pretty much everything I believe that would hint at how this game should be at the end of the child timeline. In Hyrule Historia, Ganondorf from the Four Swords Adventures is described to be a different Ganondorf from the one appearing in Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, having been reincarnated after being defeated by the hero chosen by the gods. But let's slow down a bit on that last statement. This game's Ganondorf is Gerudo, alright, but with the real Ganondorf being sealed for so long, it wouldn't make sense for no other male Gerudo to exist if the tribe was meant to survive. Remember that a male Gerudo is born every 100 years, but it has never been said that only one male Gerudo may exist at a time. Only that whenever one happens to be born, he is destined to become the new king, probably displacing the previous one and nothing more. So it may be that this Ganondorf wasn't even really related to the original one at all, and was simply born out of happenstance. The fact that they wear the same name may simply be because it is the name given to male Gerudos, or even just out of admiration of some sort. And sure, it is argued that this one is the resurrected Ganondorf from Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, but I believe that to be as authentic as Tingle being the reincarnation of a fairy at this point. Four Swords Adventures Ganondorf, in my eyes, is nothing more than the last male Gerudo born up to that point in the timeline, who happened to admire Ganondorf, and upon obtaining the trident, its power allowed him to take on the role of the man himself. But what about Zelda saying that he is the demon reborn and wielder of the trident, you may ask? Well, he never said he was the man reborn. Zelda was the one who said it. So to begin with, said trident is not present anywhere else within the child timeline and thus never actually wielded by the original Ganondorf. The trident supporting the idea of housing his power is just bonkers. Zelda somehow linking the trident with the image of Ganondorf makes no sense at all here. I believe this was but misinformation on her part. She may remember from stories passed down the royal family of Ganondorf, King of Darkness, but at the same time, wrongly remembering him as the wielder of the trident instead of the wielder of the Triforce, which by the way he doesn't seem to have in this game. Because if he had had it in the first place, why would he need the trident at all? Because the original Ganondorf never died. Given the history of terrible decision-making the royal family has committed time and time again, it is not quite impossible to think that the story they passed down was of Ganondorf's death instead of imprisonment, simply because they have an image of themselves to protect. And the lie eventually became a fact within the royal family itself over time. So, in conclusion, Four Swords Adventures Ganon is nothing more than a charlatan who was convincing enough to fool everyone else into believing that he was the reincarnation of the original Ganondorf when in fact, he's nothing more than an overpowered tingle with a god complex. Zelda Breath of the Wild is thus the child's timeline, far future. Now, like I said, this is not my usual content. Maybe if you leave some questions below, I may address them and make videos in the future, I don't know. Not really have much time for that, but I will try. If you happen to have enjoyed the video, consider giving it a like. It would really help me, I'm just starting here on the platform. And if you happen to enjoy Let's Plays, maybe consider subscribing, that would also help a lot. Thank you for watching.